Some secrets are buried beneath stone, others beneath silence. It began with a whisper, carried through the black pines of Maine. Not a legend, not a ghost story, but a fact, carefully hidden and violently protected. In the fall of 1798, 3 women arrived in the remote town of Milbridge. They called themselves nuns. They said they had fled religious persecution in England. But what they brought was no religion. It was control disguised as salvation. They rode into town on a cold October morning in a carriage loaded not with Bibles, but with crates sealed in wax and chains. Locals saw glass jars, surgical instruments, anatomy books, instruments of science, not scripture. Their names were Agatha, Prudence, and Temperance Ashford. But they were not sisters by blood. They were sisters in belief. Within days, they purchased nearly 200 acres of forested land just outside town, paying in gold coins that gleamed strangely red in the sunlight. They built what they called a sanctuary for fallen women. A gray stone building 3 stories tall, with walls thick enough to deaden screams. There were no crosses on the walls, no hymns sung at dawn, only locked doors, small windows, and thick iron bars beneath the cellar floor. The people of Milbridge called it the Convent of Eternal Tears, and that name would prove prophetic. Over the next 30 years, more than 600 women entered its gates. They came from all corners of New England, sent by families who were ashamed, terrified, or simply inconvenienced by daughters who read too much, questioned too often, or refused to marry. Some women were depressed. Others were defiant. All were promised healing. Fewer than half were ever seen again. Those who returned came back changed. They smiled too long, blinked too slowly, didn't remember the names of their siblings. They said things like, "I am better now. I belong." And the most dangerous prisons are the ones built inside the mind. Agatha Ashford was no ordinary woman. In London, she had once been a professor's assistant, fired for unauthorized experiments on emotional hysteria in women. Her understanding of pain was surgical. Her mastery of submission was precise. Prudence, tall and silent, had trained in anatomical dissection in Edinburgh. She didn't speak much. She didn't need to. Her fingers spoke for her, fluent in bone, nerve, and restraint. Temperance. She was something else entirely. Beautiful, watchful. She had a way of looking at people like she could see the rot beneath their skin. Together, the Ashford sisters built something more than a convent. They built a mechanism, a chamber of correction, a system designed not for healing, but for transformation. It operated with terrifying logic. Identify the defect, isolate the subject, eliminate resistance. And it began beneath the earth. The basement level was constructed first, before the roof, before the steeple. It took months to dig. The walls were reinforced with ship-grade timber and limestone, not for weather, but for soundproofing. Locals asked why a convent needed such a large lower level. For spiritual solitude, Agatha would say. Penitence is best done in silence. But what they built wasn't a chapel. It was a surgical theater. The windows were slits, barely visible above the snowdrifts in winter. The doors were double-bolted. Every drain led to a pit buried 20 feet beneath the forest floor. No one questioned the strange architectural choices. Why would they? The Ashfords paid handsomely, in cash, and always quoted scripture with a smile. What happened inside the stone walls became the town's most persistent question, and its deepest fear. Dr. Samuel Hartwell was the first outsider to enter. A frontier physician, modern-minded. He praised the sisters for, "They didn't erase the soul. They rewrote it." By 1802, the Convent of Eternal Tears had become more than just a curiosity in the wilderness. It was a pilgrimage site for families who wanted their daughters fixed. They came from every corner of New England. Young women, accused of being too loud, too clever, too passionate. Mothers who read too much. Wives who questioned their husbands in public. Daughters who refused arranged marriages or spoke of equality. All deemed mentally disturbed. All delivered in silence to the Ashfords. and for the right price, they never came back the same. The transformation was always praised. She's cured, they'd say. Submissive, calm, God-fearing. But beneath the praise was something colder. Fear. Because the women didn't just change behavior, they lost identity. Mary Prescott was the first that the town noticed, once sharp-witted and stubborn. She returned after 6 months with blank eyes, a still voice, and a silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt vacant. Her mother wept when Mary didn't recognize her favorite hymn. Her father called it divine deliverance, but even he stopped saying that once he saw the scars. Fine, straight lines across her scalp. Faint but real, surgical. Her hair covered most of it, but not all. And when asked about them, Mary simply smiled and whispered, "I was made new." Dr. Hartwell dismissed it as therapeutic trepanning, a European practice, cutting tiny holes in the skull to relieve pressure. He claimed it cured hysteria, but Martha Goodwin wasn't convinced. Her daughter Rebecca had returned too, with the same calm, the same smile, the same scars, but she no longer remembered her childhood dog, her best friend, or her father's name. And then there was Elizabeth Thornton. She had accused her wealthy husband of infidelity, refused to obey his public orders, and demanded a divorce. Unthinkable. In 1804, she vanished for 4 months. When she returned, she denied everything, swore her marriage was perfect, swore she had no memory of ever rebelling. Her family rejoiced. The community applauded. But in private, her brother asked her a simple question. "What's my name?" She couldn't answer. This wasn't spiritual healing. It was something else. A ritual of erasure. A science of obedience disguised as salvation. They weren't saving these women. They were silencing them. And in every case, the procedure began the same way. In the stone-walled basement, under candlelight, with scalpels cleaned in holy water, and screams drowned in prayer. What do you call a place where memories die, but bodies survive? After Elizabeth Thornton's transformation, rumors began to turn into whispers, whispers that slithered through taverns, trading posts, and winter churches. Men dismissed them as feminine hysteria, but the women knew. Something was deeply wrong inside the Convent of Eternal Tears. By 1805, the sisters had stopped appearing in public entirely. No Sunday Mass, no town council meetings, no medical consultations. Only their sealed carriages came and went from the convent, always at night, always driven by men with hollow eyes, who spoke little and answered no questions. What were they delivering? Where were they going? And why had the price for treatment doubled? Martha Goodwin had seen the scars. She'd seen the way her daughter recoiled from candlelight, her eyes blinking as if she remembered something just outside the reach of language. She began asking other mothers quiet questions, discreet visits, little exchanges in the market square. What she uncovered was horrifying. At least 9 women who had been sent to the convent were never seen again. Their families told the same story. She's chosen a life of silence. She's joined the order permanently. She has taken sacred vows. But no letters ever arrived. No visitors were allowed. No graves were shown. And then there was the smell. Hunters and loggers passing near the convent's southern perimeter began reporting a strange, sweet odor, like burnt sugar and rot, wafting from beneath the snow-covered ground. It came from the forest's edge, where the Ashfords had built what they claimed was a spiritual garden for meditation. No one was allowed in. It was surrounded by a wrought iron fence and thorn bushes that had been deliberately cultivated to discourage entry. One trapper, drunk on rum, dared to climb the fence. He returned the next day, with torn clothes, feverish eyes, and a blackened tongue. He never spoke again. Word spread, but no one acted. Because by then, the Ashfords weren't just healers. They were something more. They had the protection of Boston medical men, of Protestant elites who had sent their own daughters for correction, of judges whose mistresses returned from Maine, calm, submissive, and completely loyal. This wasn't just manipulation. It was infrastructure. Institutionalized amnesia, weaponized obedience, sanitized madness packaged as reform. And it worked. Too well. Every man in Millbridge knew, if your wife was too loud, your daughter too wild, your mistress too clever, there was a place you could send them, and they would come back broken, or not at all. The deeper you bury a secret, the more the earth rots above it. By 1807, the Convent of Eternal Tears was no longer a local curiosity. It had become a destination for the elite. Carriages bearing crests from New York, Boston, even Savannah began appearing in Millbridge's muddy streets. No questions were asked. No names were recorded. Only gold changed hands. And the convent? It expanded. Not outward, downward. Local quarrymen were paid handsomely to dig a second sub-basement beneath the already fortified structure. The stone was hauled away at night, the work done entirely by outsiders brought in from coastal cities and sent away immediately after completion. Not one remained in Millbridge. Not one would speak of what they'd seen. But the townspeople knew. Or rather, they felt it. The ground near the convent vibrated, not like an earthquake, but like a pulse. At night, the silence was no longer comforting. It was waiting. Inside, the Ashford sisters had grown more clinical, more secretive. Mother Superior Getha rarely left the underground levels. When she did appear, her face looked thinner, drawn back as if stretched from within. Her hands trembled ever so slightly, but her eyes had grown colder, calculating. Sister Prudence had become skeletal, her movements reduced to exacting patterns, repeating gestures with mechanical perfection. She rarely spoke anymore, except during procedures. And Temperance? No longer a novice. Now she wore the black veil of a full sister, though no one recalled a formal ceremony. She had grown otherworldly. Her beauty had sharpened into something uncanny, too flawless, too still. Children who glimpsed her wept without understanding why. But it was their research that drew attention, not from lawmen or clergy, from scientists. Through coded letters and elite back channels, word of the Ashfords' neurological advancements reaches. Heed the halls of Harvard, Edinburgh, and Prussia. Not as formal papers, but as ghost rumors, whispered between physicians eager to escape the limits of ethics. Some called it feminine derangement correction. Others, more honestly, called it behavioral erasure. It wasn't therapy. It was cleansing. They weren't saving women. They were repurposing them, eliminating independence, deleting memories, installing obedience. And somewhere, hidden beneath stone and frost, the sisters had begun experimenting on willing subjects. Women who had volunteered, believing they were ascending toward spiritual perfection. What they became instead was something unholy, hosts for a doctrine not found in any Bible, but carved deep into the walls of the second basement. A doctrine older than Christianity, older than language, etched in bone. And every week, someone new would enter that sacred place, thinking they were being healed, and every week, another identity would vanish forever. The mind forgets what the soul endures, but the body always remembers. As the second decade passed, the Ashford convent evolved from a reformatory into something far more refined and far more dangerous. What began as whispered praise for correcting difficult women now shifted into reverence. Politicians, clergy, and industrialists with powerful reputations began using the convent for one unspoken purpose: erasure. Not just of rebellion, but of history. Wives who threatened blackmail, daughters who discovered family secrets, mistresses with diaries. The convent became a correctional vault for reputations. The wealthy paid not for healing, but for silence. And the sisters delivered. They no longer advertised their services. They no longer needed to. A single letter, written in a specific ink, sealed with red wax and marked with the Ashford sigil, a crescent moon split by a crucifix, was all it took. 3 weeks later, the problem would disappear. Sometimes she returned, blank-eyed and passive. Sometimes she didn't return at all. The convent's success drew new scrutiny, but even the skeptics were silenced by bribes, blackmail, or worse. Several local journalists investigating the institution vanished. One was found in a river, throat crushed and tongue cut out. The others were simply never found. But there was one record no one could erase. Dr. Samuel Hartwell's private notes. His entries became fevered, manic. What began as awe turned into revulsion. They no longer remove madness. They implant something else, a persona, docile, false, but eerily stable, and beneath it, a blank. I watched them operate on a woman who had committed no crime, but refused to accept her arranged marriage. They changed her, not just in behavior, but in essence. She now refers to herself in the third person, as if her consciousness is watching her body from a distance. I am complicit, and yet I cannot stop. Their work is too advanced, too perfect. Hartwell's final journal entry ends mid-sentence. The page is splattered in dried blood. It was Temperance who delivered his body to the sheriff, claiming he had suffered a tragic fit while examining a patient. No one questioned it, but those who saw the corpse knew. His eyes were missing, surgically removed, not gouged, not damaged, just gone. Gone. As if someone wanted to ensure he never saw again, in this life or the next. And beneath the convent, sealed behind reinforced doors, the experiments continued. But they were no longer testing on women alone. Men had begun to disappear. Fathers, judges, doctors, those who asked too many questions, and those who learned the truth, that truth was never meant to be known. There are no saints in the dark, only survivors of other people's faith. By 1823, the Convent of Eternal Tears was no longer whispered about in backwoods taverns. It was spoken of in European lecture halls. Not by name, of course, but by reputation. Scholars from Vienna, Paris, and Edinburgh began referring to the Maine Institute, an anonymous American clinic conducting unparalleled advancements in psychosurgical intervention. Research papers cited techniques for inducing selective memory erasure, personality realignment, and submission through controlled trauma. The medical world believed it was theoretical. It wasn't. It was happening in that stone fortress, buried in the woods of Millbridge, under candlelight, oil, and the blank stares of compliant patients. And something else had begun. In Dr. Hartwell's missing pages, later recovered from a hollow floorboard, He described the sisters' obsession with neurospiritual resonance. They believed memories had a frequency, a soul print, that could be overwritten like music on wax cylinders. But here's where the science ended, and the occult began. Mother Agatha had acquired something, no one knew from where. It was referred to only once in the pages as the host of St. Eloria. Hartwell's journal trembled at the edges of description. It is not alive, and yet it consumes. They feed it dreams. They say it speaks in tongues of lost saints, telling them who is pure and who must be unmade. The sisters began holding midnight liturgies, rituals mixing Anglican hymns with symbols that predated Christianity by centuries. The screams ceased not because the procedures had ended, but because the victims had learned not to scream. Because screaming didn't help. In the town, strange patterns appeared. Infants born with milky eyes. Animals found dissected with surgical precision. Church bells ringing at midnight when no one pulled the rope. And the women? The reformed ones no longer blinked at fire. Their skin burned, but they showed no pain. They sat in church pews like marionettes, eyes wide open, heads tilted just slightly, listening to something no one else could hear. And when asked about their time in the convent, they gave the same answer. I am better now. I see more clearly. I was remade. Some even wrote it in letters, always in the same handwriting, no matter who sent them. Even mothers began to suspect. The daughters who returned weren't their daughters at all. They were echoes, perfected shells. And the real ones? Buried, forgotten, harvested. Sometimes, to cleanse the soul, they erase the person. By the spring of 1825, the stone walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears were coated with more than moss and time. They dripped with rituals perfected through repetition, the same prayers, the same incantations, the same scalpels carving the same incisions into silent, restrained bodies. And still, the women came. Families, brought daughters wrapped in silence and shame, disobedient wives, grieving mothers, even curious intellectual women, those who read too much, questioned too boldly, or refused to accept the roles chosen for them. All were welcomed by the Ashford sisters with the same serene smile, and all were never the same again. But outside the convent, resistance began to stir. Martha Goodwin, whose daughter Rebecca had returned from treatment with a hollow gaze and memories missing, couldn't forget or forgive. She started small, knocking on neighbors' doors, speaking in hushed tones about what she'd noticed, the scars, the memory lapses, the voices at night, the girls who never came home. She wasn't alone. By midsummer, 12 other families had joined her, and they weren't just angry, they were terrified. Because their daughters were still in their homes, but they weren't there. They smiled too much, but only at the wrong times. They stared into fireplaces for hours, murmuring hymns backwards. They wrote symbols in the margins of Bibles. They spoke of the hollowing in their sleep. And they would not, could not, remember what happened inside the convent. The townspeople begged the magistrate to launch an investigation. He refused. Too much money had changed hands. Too many powerful families, judges, landowners, clergymen, had quietly used the convent to solve their problems. But justice doesn't always come from the law. Sometimes, it comes from desperation. A plan formed, a small group of town. When you tamper with the soul, something else always comes in. The town of Millbridge never recovered from what happened that morning. The two survivors from the expedition, Isaac Dalton and Ezra Phelps, became living reminders that the Convent of Eternal Tears was no longer just a building. It was a portal. A wound in reality. Ezra sat in his mother's parlor day and night, rocking endlessly. His hands scrawled out dozens, then hundreds of drawings. Anatomical diagrams that no farmer's son should have known, constellations that didn't exist on any star chart, and always those same malformed faces. Isaac never spoke again. But every Sunday he'd walk barefoot through the town square, stopping in front of the church to carve the same phrase into the doors with a piece of flint. They opened it. By now, even the skeptics were afraid. Even Deacon Morrison, once a vocal defender of the sisters, was seen burning his own sermons in the churchyard, muttering about the false light and fractured liturgies. But the Ashford sisters remained untouched, untouchable. They still walked through Millbridge Market once a month, veiled, graceful, radiating power. No one dared confront them. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men looked away. They never needed to raise their voices, not once. Because whatever power they had discovered, it commanded obedience. And it was spreading. Reports emerged from as far away as Albany and Hartford. Women returning from the convent no longer spoke with their own voices. Some chanted in unison. Others displayed impossible knowledge, reciting Latin texts backwards, identifying strangers' sins with frightening precision. A theologian from Bowdoin College, after interviewing a former patient, fled back to campus and resigned within the hour. He never published his findings, but in a drunken confession he whispered, "They're not cur. Every doctrine begins as light. But in the hands of zealots, even heaven becomes a cage." By 1822, the Convent of Eternal Tears was no longer just an isolated institution. It had become an institutional blueprint. Across New England, whispers grew of other retreats, other houses of reform modeled after the Ashford methods. Wealthy benefactors from as far as London and Vienna sought their consultation, asking for protocols, diagrams, even building plans. And the sisters obliged. Because this was never just about control. It was about replication. What they had built in Millbridge was a prototype. And the true engine wasn't faith. It wasn't even medicine. It was obedient science. Buried in surviving letters between Agatha and a German colleague in Heidelberg was a chilling phrase. The correction of femininity is best achieved when ritual and surgery converge. These weren't theologians. They were engineers of the soul. And their tools weren't limited to knives and needles. Residents began reporting strange behaviors among former patients. In particular, they seemed to move and speak in patterns, as though following an invisible script. When several women, weeks apart, were seen standing alone in the town square at midnight, whispering the same Latin verse, "Corpus sine lumine, cor meum." It was dismissed as coincidence. But there were too many patterns. Too many recurrences. One evening, as a thunderstorm raged through the forest, a traveling peddler named Reuben Marks sought shelter at the convent's gates. What he witnessed, and later recounted on his deathbed, would never be officially recorded, but his words passed quietly from ear to ear in shadowed taverns and late-night prayer circles. He described being welcomed warmly, given soup, dry clothes, a place by the fire. And then, the midnight procession. From his window, he saw dozens of women, bereft. The deepest horrors are not screamed in shadow. They are whispered in doctrine. By the winter of 1824, Millbridge was no longer just a town. It had become a testing ground, a theater, a stage for the slow decay of individual will. The Ashford convent's reach had grown so vast, so entangled in the region's social and spiritual fabric, that even those who feared it served it. Fathers sent their daughters there not out of ignorance, but out of terrified hope. Hope that the transformation would save their family names, clean their bloodlines, return them a product more acceptable to society. Because that's what it had become, a factory for acceptable women. And the price was identity. Inside those stone walls, a more advanced ritual was emerging, not religious, not medical, something in between. A system designed not only to reshape behavior, but to erase memory and rewrite belief. We only know of it through the surviving journals of novice temperance. She wasn't supposed to write. But she did. Pages recovered from a fire-blackened satchel decades later described a process she called the liturgy of correction. a 7-stage ritual involving isolation, deprivation, repetition, and surgical intervention, designed to remove what she termed undesirable internal truths. It began with the confession stage, a forced verbal unburdening repeated for days until the subject could no longer distinguish between true memories and planted ones. Then came the white fast. No light, no human contact, just scripture played endlessly from a brass music box in a locked room barely large enough to stand. After that, the mapping, shaved scalp, inked diagrams, a precise incision along a neural corridor Temperance referred to as the path of sin. She described the moment of insertion, the tremble in the subject's limbs, the hollowing of the eyes, the moment when they stopped balai. The foundation beneath the convent's chapel held a secret so dark that even the oldest residents dared not whisper about it. Buried alive were the women who resisted the Ashford sisters' liturgy of correction, those whose minds refused to submit, whose spirits fought back against the erasure. This was no ordinary burial. The sisters had carved out an underground crypt, a labyrinth of narrow cells where the rebellious were confined in darkness so complete it fractured the mind. No light. No sound. No hope. Families were told their daughters had chosen a higher path, a life of silent devotion. But the truth was far more sinister. In those damp stone walls, the echoes of screams lingered for years. Some local legends spoke of faint cries rising through the floorboards during cold winter nights, lost souls trapped between worlds. And these crypt cells were far from empty. Archaeologists, years later, found signs of ritualistic markings, fragments of bone and metal shackles deeply embedded into the stone. It was a deliberate design of control and terror. The sisters were not only doctors or spiritual guides. They were wardens of a twisted prison, keepers of the ultimate punishment for defiance. But why? Why transform women into hollow shells? Why bury those who resisted alive beneath their sacred ground? The answer lies buried deeper in the archives. Encrypted letters exchanged between Mother Superior Agatha and mysterious European patrons obsessed with the burgeoning science of the mind. These patrons viewed the Ashford convent as a living laboratory, an experiment at the frontier of human control. Their goal was not healing, but dominion. To strip away free will and replace it with absolute obedience. To create perfect instruments of power. The convent was their blueprint, a dark prophecy written in stone and blood. And the women, the sacrifices, the correspondence between Mother Superior Agatha and her European patrons reveals something far more disturbing than mere scientific curiosity. These letters, painstakingly encoded and buried in decades-old archives, spoke of a grand vision, a network of control that transcended borders, an elite consortium bent on mastering the human psyche through manipulation, fear, and surgical precision. At the heart of their ambition was the notion of psychic sovereignty, the complete domination of mind and will, not just over the women imprisoned in that Maine convent, but over entire societies. The Ashford sisters were the ground-level agents of this dark revolution, perfecting techniques to break down identity, erase memories, and reconstruct behavior. The surgical interventions weren't merely physical. They were deliberate assaults on consciousness itself. But the sisters understood something chilling. Control wasn't only achieved through instruments or scalpels, but through ritual, doctrine, and relentless psychological conditioning. Every whispered prayer, every mandated penance, every enforced silence was a tool in their arsenal, designed to dismantle the self piece by piece. Inside the convent, women were subjected to daily rituals that blurred the lines between devotion and torment. Meditation sessions doubled as psychological reprogramming. The confessionals were more like interrogations, where even a fleeting expression of doubt could trigger punishment. And behind closed doors, the surgical theater served as a brutal reminder of the cost of resistance. The Ashford sisters were not driven by faith, but by a cold, clinical pursuit of absolute obedience, transforming rebellious spirits into compliant vessels. What makes this story even darker is the involvement of respected professionals who turned a blind eye, or worse, actively participated. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, once a beacon of progressive medicine, descended into obsession. His journals reveal a man torn between conscience and ambition, rationalizing atrocities as necessary sacrifices for the greater good. He helped legitimize the sisters' work, lending it a veneer of medical credibility that silenced skeptics and ensured a steady stream of patients. And the network extended beyond Maine. Similar institutions dotted the landscape, linked by shared techniques and secret alliances, spreading the Ashford sisters' methods far and wide. This was not an isolated horror, but a systematic campaign to engineer society's psyche from the shadows. The echoes of their methods ripple through history, shaping how institutions wield power over vulnerable populations even today. Their legacy is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority cloaked in righteousness, and about the invisible wars waged on the battlegrounds of the mind. Ready to descend further into the Ashford family's sinister legacy, the psychological grip the Ashford sisters held over their victims was absolute. But the true horror lay in how the convent erased entire lives. Not just memories, but identities. Women emerged as hollow shells, stripped of will and replaced with a programmed docility that served the sisters' dark purposes. Consider the case of Elizabeth Thornton, a merchant's wife, whose defiance threatened to unravel her family's standing. Committed under false pretenses, she re-emerged months later claiming no memory of the accusations that led to her imprisonment. She spoke of her husband with blind reverence, as if her own past had been rewritten. Her headaches and confusion masked a deeper fracture. Her very mind was splintering under the weight of enforced amnesia. This was not healing. It was obliteration. And the scars hidden beneath their hair were the grotesque signatures of invasive brain procedures, dark ink lines mapping the sisters' cruel handiwork. These were not random injuries. They were calculated, ritualistic marks, symbols of ownership branded onto living human beings. Families who dared ask questions were met with cold refusals, their concerns dismissed as hysteria or superstition. The sisters wielded their wealth and influence like weapons, silencing dissent and tightening their grip on the community. But whispers persisted, rumors of disappearances, of women who vanished without a trace after entering the convent. Martha Goodwin, whose daughter Rebecca was subjected to the convent's so-called treatment, became a fierce skeptic. She discovered that some women were never seen again, their families left with only the sisters' evasive assurances that they had chosen to remain behind, dedicated to eternal prayer. Behind the convent's stone walls, the line between captivity and sanctuary blurred into obscurity. The Ashford sisters had created not just AAP, place of confinement, but a machine of psychological subjugation, powered by fear, isolation, and surgical terror. And yet, they operated under the guise of divine mission, a holy crusade against sin, rebellion, and moral corruption. Their doctrine of control was woven tightly into religious rhetoric, making resistance seem like heresy. But this was no simple matter of faith. It was a calculated system of power, an ancient playbook rewritten in modern horrors. The Ashford family's legacy forces us to confront a brutal truth. Institutions built on trust and faith can harbor monstrous darkness beneath their sanctified facades. As you listen, ask yourself, how many secrets like these remain hidden in plain sight, cloaked by ritual and respectability? How many minds have been broken to serve the ambitions of unseen rulers? The descent into the Ashford family's twisted world is far from over. Are you prepared to hear what comes next? The Ashford sisters' reach extended far beyond the shadowed woods of Maine. Their carefully guarded secrets slipped quietly into the corridors of power, infiltrating medical institutions, religious orders, and even political circles. Letters exchanged between the convent and European scholars reveal a chilling collaboration, a dark exchange of knowledge that blurred the lines between science and occult. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford traveled frequently, her visits to Boston and Portland cloaked in secrecy. She carried crates of mysterious medical instruments and rare chemical compounds, claimed to be for the advancement of spiritual healing. But the truth was far darker. These shipments facilitated increasingly invasive experiments on the women imprisoned within the convent's stone walls. Behind closed doors, the sisters pioneered unthinkable procedures, combining crude brain surgery with psychological manipulation. Their goal was nothing less than total control over the mind, erasing defiance, rewriting memories, suppressing emotions. They sought to forge perfect obedience, creating vessels devoid of doubt or rebellion. Their methods were brutal, their precision surgical. Instruments sharpened for pain, chemicals engineered to erase entire chapters of identity. The basement chambers where these atrocities took place were no longer just a site of torment. They became a laboratory for human transformation. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, once a respected physician, was drawn deeper into the sisters' web. His journals reveal a man torn between medical curiosity and moral revulsion. He chronicled the breakthroughs and the horrors with clinical detachment, rationalizing that such sacrifices were necessary for progress. Yet in private, his writings betray a growing madness, a man haunted by the screams he could not silence. But what truly secured the sisters' power is their mastery of fear. Not just the fear of pain, but the terror of the unknown, the unseen. They cultivated an atmosphere of silence and submission, where even the faintest whisper of dissent was crushed. Local families, desperate and broken, continued to send their daughters and wives into the convent's maw. Promises of salvation masked the reality of enslavement. Each woman who entered was swallowed by the shadows, her essence stolen, her will extinguished. At the heart of this nightmare was a calculated conspiracy, a system designed to weaponize faith, to bend human souls to an unyielding will. The Ashford sisters were not mere zealots. They were architects of psychological tyranny, wielding religion as a mask for monstrous control. Now, as you stand at this crossroads, ready to peer further into this abyss, I ask you to anchor your resolve. In the comments, write the phrase, "I embrace the shadow within." Repeat it twice. This is no idle exercise. It is a pact, a declaration that you are ready to confront truths buried in darkness, to awaken from illusions crafted by the powerful. Only those willing to face the shadow can begin to reclaim their freedom. The Ashford tale is far from finished. Deeper secrets, darker rituals, and the twisted legacy of their influence still lie ahead. Are you prepared to continue? The Ashford sisters' influence seeped into the very fabric of early American society, extending like dark roots beneath the surface of polite civilization. Their convent was more than a prison. It was a crucible of transformation, where defiance was methodically extinguished and new, compliant identities forged. Whispers from nearby towns spoke of strange disappearances and unsettling behavior in women who returned. Some seemed hollowed out, their eyes empty, their personalities erased like wax melted under a cruel flame. Others vanished without a trace, swallowed whole by the stone fortress that refused to surrender its secrets. These women were not casualties of illness or accident. They were victims of a meticulously orchestrated program of control, manipulation, and erasure. The Ashford sisters had cracked a terrifying code. The mind could be dissected, reprogrammed, and dominated. More alarming was the network they cultivated to protect their operation. Local officials turned a blind eye, bribed by gold and assurances of social order. Religious leaders preached submission and obedience, unknowingly becoming tools in a grand design to suppress truth and maintain power. The convent's correspondence with European institutions hinted at a global agenda, a collaboration of shadowy elites obsessed with mastering human nature. Reports mentioned techniques that bordered on occult rituals, blending surgical precision with ancient practices designed to bind souls. Mother Superior Agatha, the mastermind behind this dark enterprise, wielded charisma and intellect like weapons. Her silver-streaked hair and cold, calculating gaze concealed a mind dedicated to absolute dominion over flesh and spirit. Sister Prudence, the executor, operated with ruthless efficiency, carrying out horrors with surgical calm. And Temperance, the youngest, watched and learned, becoming the cold Einst, ruminant of future terror. Families who dared question the sisters faced social exile, or worse. Fear was their ally, silence their most powerful tool. The convent's walls were built not only of stone, but of whispered threats, broken wills, and lost histories. As you listen, understand this. The Ashford sisters did not just destroy individuals. They shattered entire communities, eroding the bonds of trust and sowing seeds of paranoia and control. This is the hidden truth, lurking behind the veneer of early American piety and progress. A sinister tale masked by faith, ambition, and cruelty. If you've made it this far, you are no longer just a spectator. You have become part of this story, this revelation. Remember the phrase, "I embrace the shadow within." Say it twice again. Solidify your awakening. Because what lies ahead will challenge everything you believe about power, freedom, and the cost of obedience. Now, as the final chapter unfolds, understand this. The Ashford sisters' legacy did not die with them. Their methods, their dark knowledge, echoed through generations, buried in hidden archives, whispered in secret societies, and woven into the very mechanisms of control that govern society today. The Convent of Eternal Tears stands no more, its stones reclaimed by the forest, its horrors faded from public memory, but the shadows it cast stretch far beyond that remote Maine wilderness. The same insidious forces that once wielded scalpels and spiritual torture now operate with new faces, new technologies, still reshaping minds, suppressing dissent, and molding obedient bodies to unseen agendas. The Ashford family story is a warning etched in blood and silence, that beneath the polished surface of civilization lies a sinister dance of domination, a system designed to break the individual's will and replace it with submission. Ask yourself, how many reforms in history, how many whispered rumors of lost souls are echoes of this same corrupt impulse? How many institutions, cloaked in righteousness, harbor secrets darker than any horror story. The true horror is not just in the acts committed behind those stone walls. It is in the acceptance, the complicity, the silence that allowed such evil to flourish unchecked. You have been given a glimpse beyond the veil, a dangerous glimpse. But knowledge is power, and with it comes responsibility. To question, to resist, to seek the truth others fear. Remember the Ashford sisters, not as mere villains of a forgotten tale, but as symbols of a deeper, ongoing battle. A battle for your mind, your soul, your freedom. This story has changed you, whether you realize it or not. The darkness you faced here is the darkness within us all, waiting to be confronted, understood, and overcome. Now step forward with eyes wide open. The path ahead is uncertain, but it belongs to those who refuse to be controlled. You are no longer the man you were before you heard this, and the world will never be the same.